Chapter 3. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. A fortnight later, by excellent good fortune, the doctor gave one of his pleasant dinners to some 5 or 6 old cronies, all intelligent, reputable men, and all judges of good wine, and Mr. Utterson so contrived that he remained behind after the others had departed. Again, look at the word choice here of all intelligent, all reputable men. This idea of reputability, reputation, is central, obviously, to the novella, and the real idea that the Victorians had about the outward appearance and reputation, and really how that was most important. And we go on to see that actually it changes. Yes, it's important because they focus on the outward personality of the people and their reputation, but actually it fails to really take into account that inside, deep within, evil can lurk within people, but they never really think about this. And its word choices like reputable, which really do emphasise this. So they're all intelligent, reputable men, and all judges of good wine, and Mr. Utterson so contrived that he remained behind after the others had departed. This was no new arrangement, but a thing that had befallen many scores of times. Where Utterson was liked, he was liked well. Hosts loved to detain the dry lawyer when the light-hearted and loose-tongued had already their foot on the threshold. They liked to sit a while in his unobtrusive company, practising for solitude, sobering their minds in the rich man's silence after the expense and strain of gaiety. To this rule, Dr. Jekyll was no exception. And as he now sat on the opposite side of the fire, a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50, with something of a stylish cast perhaps, but every mark of capacity and kindness, you could see by his looks that he cherished for Mr. Utterson a sincere and warm affection. So again, characterizations being used, again Utterson's being described as the dry lawyer, very boring, but for people, it says earlier on in the chapter, just on the previous page, that where he was liked well, which obviously suggests that he wasn't liked by some people, but by those who liked him, they liked to stay his company. A quiet man, a thinker, and that's something that all these men seem to really value, all these men of reputation, and that in turn, of course, creates, builds and enhances Utterson's reputation. Little picture of Dr. Jekyll there. "I've been wanting to speak to you, Jekyll," began the latter. "You know that will of yours?" A close observer might have gathered that the topic was distasteful, but the doctor carried it off gaily. "My poor Utterson," said he, "you are unfortunate in such a client. I never saw a man so distressed as you were by my will, unless it were that Hyde-bound pedant." Look at that, play on the words, punning on the word Hyde. If it were that Hyde-bound pedant, Lanyon, at what he called my scientific heresies. Look at that word there, heresies. A heresy is something that is against religion, completely against religion, a heretic. Heretics would be excommunicated, thrown out the church and things like that. And so the fact that there, Jekyll's almost joking about it in a way, but he's also, sorry, let me get this, but not only that, he's telling us the word heresies, which is obviously what happened with himself and Dr. Lanyon when they fell out. So this idea of heresies, it means that Lanyon really does not like it, and it also means that it's unreligious. But again, Jekyll's laughing it off here. "Oh, I know he's a good fellow, you needn't frown, an excellent fellow, and I always mean to see more of him. But a hide-bound pedant for all that, an ignorant, blatant pedant. I was never more disappointed in any man than Lanyon." So they've had quite a falling out. "You know I never approved of it," pursued Utterson, ruthfully disregarding the fresh topic. "My will? Yes, certainly, I know that," said the doctor, a trifle sharply. "You have told me so." "Well, I tell you so again," continued the lawyer. "I've been learning something of young Hyde." The large handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the very lips, and there came a blackness about his eyes. "I do not care to hear more," said he. "This is a matter I thought we'd agreed to drop, to forget about. They'd agreed never to talk about it again." And again there, that's a really interesting, really powerful quote for you there about his reaction and how he turns. It's almost like there's a blackness about his eyes. He grew pale, even his lips grew pale, and it's almost as if the personality of Mr. Hyde is actually taking over Dr. Jekyll at the moment, if that's obviously what were to happen in the end. An incredible quote to use. And he says, doesn't care anymore, I thought we'd agreed to forget about this. And then Utterson continues, what I heard was abominable. It was absolutely terrible, said Utterson. It can make no change. You do not understand my position, returned the doctor, with a certain incoherency of manner. I am painfully situated, Utterson. My position is a very strange one. It is one of those affairs that cannot be mended by talking. Jekyll, said Utterson, you know me. I am a man to be trusted. Make a clean breast of this in confidence, and I make no doubt I can get you out of it. He's just saying to him, look, I'll stick up for you. I'll maintain your reputation. I will lie for you if need be, but you need to tell me the truth first. The doctor returns. My good Utterson, said the doctor, this is very good of you. This is downright good of you, and I cannot find words to thank you in. I believe you fully. I would trust you before any man alive. Aye, before myself, if I could make the choice. But indeed, it isn't what you fancy. It is not as bad as that. And just to put your good heart at rest, I will tell you one thing. The moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. I give you my hand upon that, and I thank you again and again. And I would just add one little word, Utterson, that I'm sure you'll take in a good part. This is a private matter, and I beg of you to let it sleep. Utterson reflected a little, looking in the fire. I have no doubt you are perfectly right, he said, at last getting to his feet. Well, but since we have touched upon this business, and for the last time I hope, continued the doctor, there is one point I should like you to understand. I have really a very great interest in poor Hyde. I know you have seen him, he told me so, and I fear he was rude. But I do sincerely take a very great interest in that young man. And if I am taken away, Utterson, I wish you to promise me that you will bear with him and get his rights for him. Utterson, I want you to promise me, if anything happens to me, if I disappear suddenly, or if I die, you've got to make sure you get everything to Mr. Hyde. You must do it. I can't pretend that I shall ever like him, said the doctor. I don't ask that, pleaded Jekyll, laying his hand upon the other's arm. I only ask for justice. I only ask you to help him for my sake when I am no longer here. Utterson heaved an irrepressible sigh. Well, said he, I promise. Chapter 4. The Carew Murder Case. Nearly a year later, so the narrative has now moved on a year later. You have here as well the number 18 and then a dash. It's symbolising a year of October 1876, whatever it is. There's a suspicion that the reason this is because Robert Louis Stevenson wrote this incredibly quickly. He essentially dreamt it. At one point, his wife would actually, she would wake up in the middle of the night because he'd be thrashing around the bed, screaming, crying in his dreams. And the story goes, she later told people that one night she awoke him because he was screaming and crying, and she said, "What's wrong with you?" And he turned to her and said, "Why did you sleep? Why did you wake me?" And she said, "Because you were screaming and you were crying." And he replied, "It was a great dream. You should never have woken me. I was nearly there." And so he dreamt a lot of this novella, and he wrote it incredibly quickly. And one of the ideas is that the reason that he's left this dash is because he wrote it so quickly. It was something he meant to go back to another time, never got back to it. So there's a few ideas why that has a dash there. Nearly a year later, in the month of October 18 London was startled by a crime of singular ferocity and rendered all the more notable by the high position of the victim. So the narrative's taking us on a year later now, and again, the Carew murder case. It sounds like a police report, some kind of police report in a file, and the way that the writing is very dry. It's very straight to the point, very matter of fact. It doesn't It's not one of the most. It's not a novella that's rich with poetic imagery all throughout, apart from when Stevenson begins to describe London, which we'll get onto later on. You need to look at the language, and it is so straight and matter of fact, and it is only through these later moments that will show that it comes to life a little bit. And that's also reflected in the narrative of Mr. Utterson. Utterson's such a dry fellow. He's such a dry, boring kind of character. It forces although he's not the narrator, because it's his point of view, it forces the narrative to be quite dry. And again, this juxtaposes, this is in complete, utter contrast to when Hyde really comes to life and does horrible things. The language is different, the way it's written is completely different as well. And that can be seen as reflecting a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde, a bit like outward appearances and reputation. On the outside of things, the narrative is written in very nice, straight to the matter, straight to fact, almost like a police report kind of English. And then it's almost in the moment of Hyde's terror that it begins to come to life, and it changes. So not only do characters change, also the narrative changes and the style and the way it's written in. And keep an eye out for this throughout this chapter. So a year later, London was shocked by a disgusting, a horrible, ferocious crime, even more so because of the high position of the victim. He was high up in society. The details were few and startling. A maid-servant living alone in a house not far from the river had gone upstairs to bed about 11. Although a fog rolled over the city in the small hours, the early part of the night was cloudless, and on the lane where the maid's window overlooked was brilliantly lit by the full moon. It seems she was romantically given, for she sat down upon her box, which stood immediately under the window, and fell into a dream of musing. She used to say with streaming tears when she narrated that experience, never had she felt more at peace with all men or thought more kindly of the world. So she felt like she'd never been so peaceful and at peace in that one before. And again, look at the way setting creates atmosphere, helps to create the atmosphere throughout the paragraph. The moonlight obviously here reassure us as readers, make us feel a bit safer. But as we have this fog that rolled in just beforehand, being told in the small hours of the morning, so 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, we're told the early part of the night was cloudless, so it was clear, it was safe. And it's these moments of cloud rolling and the real descriptions of London that Stevenson uses is really when it's very vivid and the imagery really comes to life. Sorry, I could do that as well. Again, the narration is making us feel even more sorry for the maid. We have a lot of sympathy for this maid and for what she saw. And as she sat, she became aware of an aged, beautiful gentleman with white hair drawing near along the lane, and advancing to meet him, another and very small gentleman, to whom at first she paid less attention. When they had come within speech, which was just under the maid's eyes, so they stopped below her window so that she could obviously hear it, the older man bowed and accosted the other with a very pretty manner of politeness. It did not seem as if the subject of his address were of great importance. Indeed, from his pointing, it sometimes appeared as if he was only inquiring his way. So an old guy stopped and started speaking to this shorter man, this very small gentleman. And we're told, it told that it didn't matter of any great importance, but the moon shone on his face as he spoke, and the girl was pleased to watch it. It seemed to breathe in such an innocent of old-world kindness of disposition, yet something high too, as of a well-founded self-content. So again, it's really nice. It should be. The writer's creating a nice environment. It's a nice atmosphere. It seems like it's nice. The old man's asked the young man something, and they're talking, and it seems like a nice thing. Presently her eye wandered to the other, and she was surprised to recognise him, a certain Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master, and for whom she'd conceived a dislike. So again, another character instantly disliking this Mr. Hyde. He had in his hand a heavy cane like a walking stick, and with which he was trifling, he was playing about, but he never answered a word, and seemed to listen with an ill-contained impatience. So the old man's talking to this wee guy, and as he's doing so, this small gentleman is beginning to get annoyed, and he's got a walking stick, a big thick wooden walking stick, and he's beginning to bang it up, maybe tap it off the ground and things. So, nice and gentle, just having a conversation. This wee guy's getting a bit annoying, but it seems to be fine. And then the writer suddenly tells us what happens, and it's quite shocking to us as readers. We're told he had in his hand a heavy cane with which he was trifling, but he answered never a word. He didn't reply to any of what the old guy said, and seemed to listen with an ill-contained impatience. And then all of a sudden he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying, as the maid described it, like a madman. The old gentleman took a step back, with the air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt. And at that, Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth. And the next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered and the body jumped upon the roadway. He started battering him, smashing him with his cane, and then with the cane he smashed him until he was down on the ground. And then he stood all over him, trampling him, kicking him, and then he got down with his fists and he punched him so hard with such strength and such ferocity, this old man's bones the maid could hear break. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. It was 2 o'clock when she came to herself, and she woke up and called for the police. The murderer was gone long ago, but there lay his victim in the middle of the lane, incredibly mangled. An incredible word choice, mangled. It's not a word you would necessarily, you'd mangle, people would perhaps mangle their hand in heavy machinery and things, but the word mangled just gives us the idea of the body being all over the place, completely broken in pieces and horrible. The stick with which the deed had been done, although it was of some very rare and some very tough and heavy wood, had broken in the middle under the stress of this insensate cruelty, and one splintered half had rolled into the neighbouring gutter. So he'd hit him so hard the cane had actually broken in two, and half of it had gone into the gutter. The other, without doubt, had been carried away by the murderer. A purse and gold watch were found upon the victim, but no cards or papers, except a sealed and stamped envelope, which he had been probably carrying to the post, and which bore the name and address of Mr. Utterson. So the dead old man, a purse, a wallet of money, and a gold watch were found there. So they hadn't been stolen, so it wasn't trying to rob him and kill him for money or anything like that. And there was no identification or anything like that, although people obviously knew who he was, being a politician. But all there was a sealed and stamped envelope, which he had probably been carrying to the post, and which bore the name and the address of Mr. Utterson. So it's suggesting that Sir Danvers Carew was all he had on his person was a gold watch, a purse, and a letter addressed to Mr. Utterson. So this letter was then brought to the lawyer the next. I'll quickly do there. So the writer's building up suspense and tension through this piece of information by not going into a great deal of detail, but leaving us wondering as to what the letter, not kettle, sorry, a bit embarrassing, what the letter contained and why Hyde didn't take it. So the questions now are to be asked: was the letter from Hyde to be given to Utterson by Carew, the murder victim, or why is there a letter? Who's it from? The narrator is saying probably, because there's no certainty and that's what was happening, but he's suggesting that Carew had this letter for Utterson in his pocket. But again, something else might have been about. So this letter was brought to the lawyer the next morning before he was out of bed, and he had no sooner seen it and been told of the circumstances than he shot out a solemn lip. "I shall say nothing till I have seen the body," said he. "This may be very serious. Have the kindness to wait while I dress." And with the same grave countenance, he hurried through his breakfast and drove to the police station whither the body had been carried. As soon as he came into the cell, he nodded. "Yes," said he, "I recognise him. I am sorry to say that this is Sir Danvers Carew. Good God, sir, exclaimed the officer. Is it possible? And the next moment his eye lighted up with professional ambition. This will make a deal of noise. Everyone will talk about this. Everyone's going to know about it, he said. And perhaps you can help us to the man. And he briefly narrated what the maid had seen and showed the broken stick. So the police officer is now asking Utterson if he can perhaps help them and help them to find this character, Mr. Hyde, that's obviously got him. Goes on to tell us, Mr. Utterson had already quailed at the name of Hyde, but when the stick was laid before him, he could doubt no longer. Broken and battered as it was, he recognised it for one that he had himself presented many years before to Henry Jekyll. Years ago, Utterson had given it to Jekyll as a gift. And look here, when he could doubt no longer, and that obviously suggests to us that Utterson doesn't want to believe that there's anything untoward with it. He doesn't want to believe that Jekyll's involved. Utterson wants to believe that Jekyll is in danger from Hyde, if anything, and Hyde's a horrible man. He doesn't want to think that Dr. Jekyll could be in any way related to these crimes. Not at all. Mr. Utterson's really worried about Jekyll's reputation and his reputation being lost. If it was to, the more people that know that Jekyll and this Mr. Hyde are connected in some way, that obviously everything goes to Hyde. This will ruin Jekyll's reputation. Utterson cannot fathom, he cannot believe, he cannot begin to think that Jekyll would ever be connected to this sort of person. So, at the same time, Utterson, the Victorian society's obsession with the outward appearance of the self and of reputation, Utterson's not allowing himself to even consider the possibility to be open to the idea of Dr. Jekyll being able to do it. So therefore he's society and the way it is forces Utterson not to even consider that a man as good as Jekyll could even do such things or be connected to such things. And he can't believe that obviously this is the stick that he gave him. The stick is now broken. He now knows that Jekyll is definitely connected to him and it's close, but he probably wants to believe that Hyde's stolen it as opposed to even be given by Jekyll. Is this Mr. Hyde a person of small stature? He inquired. Particularly small and particularly wicked looking is what the maid calls him, said the officer. Mr. Utterson reflected, and then, raising his hand, if you will come with me in my cab, he said, I can take you to his house. And remember, a cab's a horse-drawn carriage. It's not an actual car or anything like that. Oh, sorry. And again, wicked looking being used to describe Hyde. It was by this time, about 9 o'clock in the morning, and the first fog of the season. Now look at this. Look at the way that this is where we're getting poetic. It's so dry, matter of fact, and we're now getting into a great chocolate-coloured pall lowered over heaven, but the wind was continually charging and rooting these embattled vapours. Look at the word choice. I mean, this language is poetic. It's rich, vivid imagery, beautiful poetry, but it's being used to describe the sinister, dark, dangerous, violent atmosphere that London is. This rolling fog creates London to be, and it shows London to be evil. It's this fog that Hyde embodies. The fog is nature's embodiment almost of the evil that is within Mr. Hyde. So we're told it was about this time at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the first fog of the season. The first fog. That suggests there's lots of fog, obviously. A great chocolate-coloured pall lowered over heaven, but the wind was continually charging and rooting these embattled vapours, so that as the cab crawled from street to street, Mr. Utterson beheld a marvellous number of degrees and hues of twilight, different shades of twilight. For here it would be dark like the back end of evening, and there would be a glow of a rich, lurid brown, like the light of some strange conflagration. And here, for a moment, the fog would be quite broken up, and a haggard shaft of daylight would glance in between the swirling wreaths. The dismal quarter of Soho, seen under these changing glimpses, with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers, and its lamps, which had never been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to combat this mournful reinvasion of darkness, seemed, in the lawyer's eyes, like a district of some city in a nightmare. Remember, Utterson's had these nightmares. He's had nightmares of horrible things happening, all the fog in Victorian London. He's dreamt about it. Now, as he's going through and he's going to Mr. Hyde's house, the address they have for Mr. Hyde, he is witnessing it. Utterson is beginning to actually almost enter into his nightmares. This evil that Mr. Hyde started off doing entered Utterson's subconscious a year or so ago, and he started dreaming about it and having these horrible nightmares. It is now permeating his life, his experiences. He is living, he is going throughout this nightmare street, this nightmare environment. The thoughts of his mind, besides, were of the gloomiest dye, and when he glanced at the companion of his drive, he was conscious of some touch of that terror of the law and the law's officers, which may at times assail to the most honest. As the cab drew up before the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street, a gin palace, a low French eating house, so really horrible kind of shops which obviously would have a gin palace, a gin bar basically, so full of alcoholism, all the nasty, dark, dangerous sides of London and society and life and the human soul which Hyde embodies that are living in these parts of London. The type of London which is so different from the straight-laced, reputation-conscious London that we see in the other narratives. Utterson is now entering this world, this other world, if you like. So there's a gin palace, a low French eating house, like a wee restaurant, a shop for the retail of penny numbers and 2-penny salads, many ragged children huddled in the doorways, and many women of many different nationalities passing out drunk, key in hand, to have a morning glass. And the next moment the fog settled down again upon that part, as brown as umber, and cut him off from his blackguardly surroundings. This was the home of Henry Jekyll's favourite, a man who was heir to £250,000 sterling. £250,000 sterling. That is millions and millions of pounds now. An incredible amount of money that Hyde will receive if Jekyll was to die. And there, everyone near to where Hyde lives appears to be destitute and the bad sign of London. They're underfed, they're poorly clothed, they're nourished, the word choice of ragged children, alcoholic women, instead of looking after poor children or drinking instead. This is a horrible place. So he knocks on this door, and an ivory-faced and silvery-haired old woman, almost like a witch almost, opened the door. She had an evil face, smoothed by hypocrisy, and even those associates with Hyde are described as having an evil or wicked face. And again, it's the faces. Narrator seems to trust people based on their faces. What's it trying to suggest? Well, it's the idea again of outward appearance and reputation. Everyone's judged by their appearances and the way they look. But the fact is that everybody who's associated with Hyde seems to be, well, evil it seems. She had an evil face smoothed by hypocrisy, but her manners were excellent. Yes, she said, this is Mr. Hyde's, but he was not at home. He had not been in that night very late, but he had gone away again in less than an hour. There was nothing strange in that. His habits were very irregular, and he was often absent. For instance, it was nearly 2 months since she had seen him until yesterday. Well, very well then. We wish to see his rooms, said the lawyer, and when the woman began to declare it was impossible, I had better tell you who this person is, he added. This is Inspector Newcomen of Scotland Yard, the police. We're then told, a flash of odious joy. Odious means repulsive and horrible, which fits in with her evil face. However, why would this woman seem so happy that Hyde might be in trouble, and why would that be repulsive? So it's just a real oxymoron. Odious joy is a horrible, disgusting kind of joy, but she seems to be very happy and she's excited about the idea that Hyde's in trouble. So a flash of odious joy appeared upon the woman's face. Ah, she said, he's in trouble. What? He is in trouble. What has he done? Mr. Utterson and the inspector exchanged glances. He don't seem like a very popular character, observed the latter. And now, my good woman, just let me and this gentleman have a look about us. In the whole extent of the house, which but for the old woman remained otherwise empty, Mr. Hyde had only used a couple of rooms, but these were furnished with luxury and good taste. A closet was filled with wine, the plate was of silver, the napery elegant, a good picture hung upon the walls, a gift, as Utterson supposed, from Henry Jekyll, who was much of a connoisseur, because he knows that Jekyll's an expert in art, he has lots, he loves it, and there's a great big picture that's on the wall, and he assumes that Jekyll, being the great man that he is, and a connoisseur of art that he is, has bought Hyde this picture. He's bought this painting just for him, because which again links him closer. So a gift, as Utterson supposed, from Henry Jekyll, who is very much a connoisseur, and the carpets were of many piles and agreeable in colour. At this moment, however, the rooms bore every mark of having been recently and hurriedly ransacked. Clothes lay about the floor, with their pockets inside out. A lockfast drawer stood open, and on the hearth there lay a pile of grey ashes, as though many papers had been burned. From these embers the inspector disinterred the butt end of a green cheque-book, which had resisted the action of the fire. The other half of the stick was found behind the door, and as this clinched his suspicions, the officer declared himself delighted. So they've gone inside, and they've managed to find. It looks as if Hyde's left this place really quickly. There's clothes all over the place. It looks like it's been turned over, and there's a big pile of grey ashes. Lots of letters and papers and things have been burned recently, and also a green cheque-book. The very end of that was found. And then the other half of the stick was found behind the door, and so obviously the policeman now knows this is Mr. Hyde's residence. So because of the bank book, obviously it means he's got a bank account, and they were told a visit to the bank, where several £1,000s were found to be lying to the murderer's credit, completed his gratification. So Hyde burned some papers and attempted to burn a cheque-book as well, the same which he presumably used to bribe the trampled girl's family. When the police inspector and Utterson checked with the bank, they found a lot of money deposited into that account, into Hyde's account. So they also found the other half of the broken walking stick that he found that he used to kill Carew. So, you may depend upon it, sir, he told Mr. Utterson. I have him in my hand. He must have lost his head, or he never would have left the stick, or, above all, burned the cheque-book. So he must have gone crazy. You know, why would he have left the stick behind? Why would he have tried to burn the cheque-book? Why? Money's life to the man. We have nothing to do but to wait for him at the bank and get out the handbills. This last, however, was not so easy of accomplishment, for Mr. Hyde had numbered few familiars. He had no friends. Even the master of the servant maid had only seen him twice. His family could nowhere be traced. He had never been photographed, and the few who could describe him differed widely, as common observers will. Only on one point were they agreed, and that was the haunting sense of unexpressed deformity with which the fugitive impressed. So, very quickly there, so the word choice of haunting, obviously. And although people couldn't, people couldn't never really describe what he looked like. We've never really had a clear description of him apart from being a small man and he creates hate within everyone he encounters. We have no photographs. Nobody really knows what he looks like. Nobody really knows who he is. He doesn't have any acquaintances, doesn't have any friends. There's no family that can trace. It really does feel like he's otherworldly almost, like he's of a different world or a different realm, something. It adds to the intrigue and to the mystery of this man. And for blue there, obviously, the word choice, the word haunting. Only on one point were they agreed, and that was the haunting sense of unexpressed deformity with which the fugitive impressed his beholders. So whenever people saw this Mr. Hyde, they were just so absolutely disgusted and repulsed by the way he looks, by the way that he is so disgusting, so ugly, so repulsive. And as I say, it really gives that idea that Hyde is of a different dimension, he's of a different realm, he's not on this planet. The description when Utterson, with the horse and carriage, his cab, when himself and the police inspector from Scotland Yard, when they go into the Soho area and they start describing it, the setting that Stevenson uses as a writer, Stevenson really uses this incredible amount of vivid setting, using really incredible poetic techniques to really set the atmosphere. He uses the setting and his word choice and simply the poetry within it to really describe this fog. And I would argue that this fog really gives a similar feeling to the reader as the descriptions of Mr. Hyde. We feel uneasy when both are, and like I say, that can be analysed and read as being that it's a representation of the other, it's the evil, it's Stevenson's acknowledgement that we are born with good and evil, whereas the Victorians believed that, good people were good and certainly religious people were good and everything like that. There's this real idea that there's evil within everyone, and it comes out, it manifests itself even through Stevenson's writing, through the descriptions of London, through the way that London and Soho changes, and it all comes back to this evil, this horror, this terror that Hyde brings upon people. And that's when you start to see that Hyde's otherworldly, if you like. He's of a different world almost. He's able to personify evil. He's almost like Satanesque, if you like. He's like the devil almost. And Hyde personifies this, and it's in his area, it's in his surroundings, it's in the way he speaks, it's in the way he's described. And as I say, the writing really changes from being really formal, really policeman report-like, really efficient, really lawyer kind of like, very factual. It shifts from that to these beautiful poetic descriptions when it describes the fog, but it describes it as being really terrifying and evil and difficult. Make sure obviously that you've got notes on all of these ideas, and as always, don't simply be taking my word for it to be getting A's, your A's and B's. You need to be developing this analysis, taking it on to another level, thinking what else it suggests, linking to other parts of the novella. Remember the themes of the duality of the human self and of reputation and outward facing, reputation, the importance of reputation and the duality of the human self. And everything you think about, all your analysis, try to tie into those kind of themes, and also make sure that you're getting good quotes down as well.